Okay, I'm Helmi. Hello, Prof. James. We met in SOAS a few years ago in London. Yeah, all right. Okay. So yeah, I want to ask about this modern globalization and the trends of the rise of right-wing extremisms, and it seems that it's about contestation of interest, and it's somehow for me looking from a realist view, it's hard to go more into a cosmopolitanism view of one ummah. And yeah, is it possible in near future that this can expand, because it seems that people are more and more thinking about their own interests rather than others. And is it possible also to gather social solidarity?
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Miftah. I'm from Ijabi, the Association of Ahlul Bait Followers from Indonesia. Yeah. All this time I've been reading your articles, and now thank you for seeing you in person. I would like to ask you, from the first slide you mentioned about Shia Muslim. And our organization actually sometimes people consider it as a Shia Muslim organization, although actually it is open for anyone. But thank you for taking us on the roller coaster of 14 centuries, up and downs and everything. Unfortunately, for example, you have not mentioned reading political Islam from Shia perspectives or from Shia resources. As we can see right now, probably in the world, the Islamic Republic of Iran could be called as those people who are actually implementing or trying to implement the political Islam in their systems. So I think it will be interesting to see, because right now there are so many views even in the discussion of within the Shia community. For example, probably more closer to Ali Abdul Razik, the view. And actually we have that even in Sunni resources. For example, when Fatah Makkah and Abu Sufyan saw the coming of Muslim soldiers holding two torches, and Abu Sufyan said, "That's mulk." But the other one said, Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib said, "That's not mulk, that's nubuwah." So the Prophet, according to this view, does not come to establish a or a political leadership or something like that. It's a nubuwah, a different one. Even when we are talking about the Constitution of Medina, according to one version, there is one sentence that has been repeated a lot, which is ala rib'atihim. Ala rib'atihim. It mentioned all over on that Constitution of Medina. So it is interesting probably to dig more into the Shia perspective or the Shia resources. They have the discussion of Wilayatul Faqih, for example, with the pros and the cons and so many things. Probably I would like to know your perspective on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent questions. I don't have an answer for any of them, but excellent questions. So in the first one, the whole question about interests and whether or not there's a possibility of somehow creating some form of social or larger consensus which would help to guide the future of Muslim communities and the future of Islam. I mean, yes, I mean, I suppose it's possible, but I do see all the problems, and the problems have a lot to do with not with the political manipulation of people's beliefs, etc. The intrusion of political authorities into what should be the religious life of others. When those intrusive sort of things occur, those actions occur, it's obviously going to be very difficult for people to maintain a kind of a Khaldunian sort of solidarity in response to it. So I think the challenges are there. What we need, of course, and this is this is an ideal response rather than a realistic one. I mean, what we need is popular movements of various sorts where people in this case, we'll say Muslims, are able to identify what they think should be the right path and to call their rulers to task. And to say, sorry, you say that you're doing this because you're perpetuating, you're defending Islam in various ways or defending religion, but in fact what you're doing is you're going against the principles of Islam. So there's always the possibility of forms of overlapping and maybe well-guided interests. But there's a formidable array of power against it. And so I think all of us should have a very healthy feeling for the difficulties of getting your message across. And that kind of links with Hasnan's point. So instrumentalization. Yeah, it's exactly what I was talking about, was the state or the government rulers or political, and including, by the way, Islamist movements. Today, some of them pretending, not all of them, but some pretending that they have the answer and extinguishing any form of debate within, for example, or trying to impose it on society. I mean, for example, I didn't want to go too far into it, but Maududi is a great figure, right? At the end of the day, Maududian thought is pretty totalitarian. I'm sorry, but it's basically, in order to defend religion, you have to have this government, and you do what the government says. That's it. And so there's a bad instrumentalization. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah talked about instrumentalization of religion, but again, it was for the defense of religion, not the manipulation of religion for the defense of a political interest or political power. So if regimes, political candidates, political authorities invoke Islam or invoke religion as a way of legitimizing their position to win votes, whatever, obviously, to my mind, that is an improper instrumentalization. I'm going to get in trouble, aren't I? I'm going to get thrown out of the country. The Shia question and the last set of questions was, I thought, very interesting. Absolutely, and many writers on political theory kind of make the argument that the Shia have maintained, at least classically, have maintained more of the idea of the need for religious legitimacy in leadership than the Sunnis, who have essentially secularized leadership. The imams were absent, so you could basically argue that this allowed for a kind of a greater sense of moral validity to leadership, whereas the Sunnis were actually governing and therefore had to come to terms with the kind of necessities or pragmatism of politics. So some argue that Shiism has inherent in it a much more religio-political order. Maybe, to some extent. But then again, when we get to the places where they did govern, so, from the Safavids on in Iran, etc., there's again the same kind of separation, in fact, between those who are really governing and between those who presumably were the religious authorities. The current situation, and again, I'm really simplifying it, but the current situation is, to my mind, one of the negative examples of an Islamic state. So they call it an Islamic republic. So in other words, it's the invention of a political system in the 20th century which didn't exist before and doesn't really have any sound theoretical roots, and becomes an excuse for the power of an entrenched class. Here, the ulama. Here, the ayatollahs. But it's just, they're just the political rulers. So to my mind, in other words, it gets distorted. When it becomes the Islamic Republic, when it becomes the Islamic State of Iran, then then the message gets distorted. So if there was that kind of inherent idea within Shiism of a kind of the moral validity of leadership is what counts above all, now what counts is what do the Ayatollahs want and are you obeying them? And I liked your reminder about the Mulk Nabuwa point. I think that's well taken, and I think you're right. And in other words, I sound as if I'm like this radical secularist. I'm not. I do think that Abdul Razak has had a bad rap. He's had unfair criticism. I mean, after all, this, as I keep saying, this was an alim. This was a sheikh. This is a guy at Al-Azhar. I mean, he wasn't crazy. And anyway, but his arguments have been made to seem extreme. And if you remind us that somebody says here that we have, Abu Sufyan says that this distinction between mulk and nubuwah, exactly, this is prophecy. So just make your distinction between prophecy and the state, as it were. Absolutely. And I didn't get a chance to really develop it, but I kind of think Qutb has also had a bad rap sometimes too. But in some ways, his and Maududi's taking of the mulk idea and translating it into a religified concept of sovereignty is also gone off the rails in the wrong way too.
We'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow, but I think Jim alluded to this, and he certainly talked about it a lot in the book that he co-wrote, Muslim Politics, that I think both the Muslim Brotherhood and Maududi's group, the group that he formed, I think one of the best things to keep in mind for their versions of totalitarianism, which I think they are in some ways, is that they're responding to the modern state, which is itself quite totalitarian. I mean, the modern state has intruded in our lives in ways that I think that in some ways they recognized, and they co-opted that. And their own political version of Islam is infused with that. Because the life of individuals that transferred from what was the Ottomans to the modern state is dramatic. The Ottomans were in no way as entrenched in people's lives as the modern state of Turkey, as the modern state of Egypt, as any other modern state. So I think they're really responding to something that I'm not going to say that they were prophetic in the way they saw it coming, but I think they were trying to create a version of political Islam that would stand up against and be a substitute for exactly what was coming and what has in fact happened in many Muslim majority countries, is that the state has taken over. And we have state Islam, and then we have competing versions, depending on how open these countries are, to politicized versions of Islam that can chip away at this kind of stuff. And this is not just in the Muslim majority world. This is in the West. The U.S. is filled with religious politics. These things are not separated in the U.S. There might be structural separation, but you can't take away the fact that there is cultural integration. So these things, I don't think that it's possible to separate these things and keep them apart. And I don't think the notion that you're going to take away the instrumentalization of religion, let alone Islam, I'm sorry, good luck with that one. That is never, I mean, that is a pipe dream, because that's competitive politics, and people use anything and everything. And religion is a great thing to instrumentalize, especially in, of course, very religious countries, like in Muslim majority countries, and I would say also in the US. It's done all the time in the US. And the debates are still going on.
Kicked off with two questions of my own, actually. It's something that departs from what Prof. Jeffrey Kenny mentioned. Because I think in the presentation that you gave just now, you talk about much of the political projects that being proposed by the Islamists all the way back till the modern times as well, is a kind of a response towards certain pragmatic concerns. And a lot of the concepts, like akimia and other things as well, is what you said as a modern invention. But again, what do we mean by modern here, specifically? Maybe you can elaborate on that, as well as now that we are moving on towards a more digital world where reality is not really confined to the physical world anymore. Are we talking about a postmodern kind of world now, and how does that gonna affect the kind of discourse that we have? That's the first question. The second question is this: a lot of talks about how much of the thinkers are trying to adapt, coming up with creative ideas to adapt with the certain situation that they are in. But in what way we can think about the tradition, the Islamic tradition, that not only be able to provide a source of adaptation, but a source of transformation as well, where it can inspire a new imagination of political order, instead of just adapting to what are the surroundings, if you like, that are either being imposed or something that they just born into it in a way. So that's my question. Anybody else wanted to comment or ask any questions to the panels? So, okay, we'll sit with that one first, and maybe we can see if there's the next round will be any questions from the floor.
One of the modernity question is just, I was just trying to historicize it for us. I would say basically from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. So that's really what I meant. We know that, for example, there's been a lot of discussion. A lot of it is tied to the decline of the caliphate. So by the time we get to the end of the 19th century, it's pretty clear that the caliphate is pretty much a spent institution. And I think, I'm pretty sure it was Rashid Rida who began to, and others, by the time we get to the early 20th century, are starting to talk about hukuma Islamiyya, the Islamic government, and so as a concept, and this is a kind of like meant to be the displacement or the replacement of the caliphate. So he wasn't using the term caliphate, khilafah, he was using hukuma Islamiyya. So it was like, okay, where did that come from? And then that elides into Dawla Islamiyya, and etc. So it's kind of almost tied to the by the late 19th century, certainly by the time we get to the early 20th century, the 1920s, etc. But I suppose what I also mean is the self-consciousness. It's a kind of picking up Jeff's point that one of the hallmarks of modernity is for good or ill, is particularized categorization. So, if you see what I mean, it's the taking of, one might say in the pre-modern period, we might have ideas and knowledge which is kind of comprehensive, flowing into one into the other. By the time we get into the modern period, we now start to identify things in blocks. So we say, this is something called the state, and then, or in education, this is called political science, this is called anthropology, this is called sociology. So in other words, increasing specializations or categorization is a hallmark of, I would say, is a hallmark of modernity. And so in that sense as well, the identification of it. But I don't want to lose Jeff's point here that in a sense there are models which they are attempting to emulate, again, probably wrongly, but they're trying to do it. So in that sense, modern, I think. The second question I already forgot. As transformative. Yeah. Okay. So, I guess so. Here's a maybe more complex answer than I should give. I mean, it does seem to me that traditions, as I try to argue, are kind of like a collective memory. They are important. They have a social function. They do link you to your past. They link you to your future. There's a broad, continuous, symbolic form to these traditions, but what they actually mean in different periods will depend upon the demands of the time and those who are shaping the ideas of the time. So, what's an example? Shura, ijma, ijtihad. Okay, the basic concepts, the basic traditions that we would say are venerable traditions of Islam. Yeah, maslaha. Shatibi talked about it. Ibn Taymiyyah talked about it. But are we going to say that our the tradition of Islam, which puts an emphasis on maslaha, is the same that this guy in the 14th century thought? No, of course it's going to be different. It's going to be a different interpretation. We're living in different societies, etc. So I guess it is important that we recognize that Islam would put a moral approval on the idea that the people's public interest matters, and that is not disconsonant with divine guidance. Not. I think it's really important to say that. Now, what it actually the public interest of the moment is, that depends on particular circumstances.
Do you have any more questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. I am Afani Mukhtar from Fahmina Institute, Indonesia. I just want to ask your comment on Islam Nusantara. It is not Jaringan Nusantara, but Islam Nusantara. I don't think it is a new religion or a new madhab in Islam, but it is more political expression of Indonesian Muslims that want not to be called Arabization. So, how do you see this kind of position in terms of three trends of political Islamic thought? Because Indonesia consider the current system of politics based on Pancasila is Islamic, according to majority of Indonesian Muslim. So I would like your comment on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't. It's a good question. Thank you, and I would love to talk to you more about it because I don't know that much about the specific circumstances of Indonesia. So I can only do it, in a broad sense. But let me just say, broadly speaking, we now have these kind of specific ways we refer to Islam. So we use, so there's that terminology in Indonesia, or there's I was just recently talking to Al-Azhar Sheikh, and he's saying, it's Wasati Islam, Wasatiyah, etc. So, and you talk to the Moroccans, and they talk about enlightened Islam. So we're now getting adjectival Islam, and in some ways, and sort of finding the right adjective to attach to it, and I think that's fine. I think that's fine. So I guess my general view would be I don't have any particular concern about the development of a version of Islam which is supposed to present basic ideas. Where it becomes a problem is when it then gets solidified into an instrument of power, like it's kind of a ruling ideology sort of argument. So I don't. If and when that occurs, then I think it becomes then you've just distorted, you've ideologized the religion, and that's wrong. So it's kind of like the one has to walk that carefully, that middle path, the articulation of a program of action without necessarily letting it harden into the doctrine of power. That I know is difficult, and it would be, I think, something that one has to be vigilant about all the time. Now, the case, just one more sentence about Indonesia. The case about Pancasila, etc. See, I can see, and you know more better than I, you could see that there would be many people in the Muslim world might say, what's this got to do with Islam, right? That it's not Islam. Why are the Indonesians so hesitant to embrace Islam? I know they don't want to call themselves an Islamic state, etc. But in a way, consistent with what I was just sort of arguing, Shatabi, consistent with even some of Taymiyyah, certainly consistent with Khaldun. Why not Pancasila as an expression of the underlying social reality? The expression, which it is, the underlying social reality of the divided, of a society of pluralism, of many different parts, many different approaches. Considering that, then if that's what it is, that seems perfectly fine to me. But you're an Indonesian, so
no. I'm currently at Gajah Mada University for the year, so I've been listening to a lot of this stuff, and because I come back and forth, I guess part of my question for a lot of this is because there's been a series of iterations of this in Malaysia, and the latest one, as we all know, is Rahmatan lil Alameen. There was Wasatiyah, but there still is Wasatiyah in some places. There was Islam Badari. There was Islamization under Mahathir I, the first version of Mahathir. Now we're on to something else. I don't think there's anything wrong with this, but I think Jim's point is that when it comes from the top down, this is really a form of political Islam. This is really a form of sloganeering and of pushing certain kinds of agendas. And if it's just for social unity, that's fine, but if it's social unity that's used for conformity, then it becomes, I think, a serious problem. I think the advantage of Islam Nusantara is that it was more grassroots from the movement, and it wasn't from the government trying to necessarily impose it. And I think there is a kind of healthy dose of globalization here, a realization that perhaps a kind of nativistic or naturalistic version of Islam in Indonesia was being deformed, deviated from, or whatever. But the truth of the matter is this stuff is so interwoven now. Arab influences are everywhere, and you're not going to pull this stuff out. And what is authentic now in Indonesia? What's authentic in Malaysia? What's authentic in America about Islam in America, or even this notion of authenticity, I think, is very, very problematic. So, I mean, I have no trouble with them, but I do think they seemingly come in waves, and the next political generation is coming up with its own wave, and then it gets reinvented. And in some cases, I think it's just a matter of controlling the discourse, of the public discourse, which means your discourse. And to the extent that this gets imposed from the top down institutionally, that every government, every government agency is going to have posters up, every school is going to be teaching it, and to be quite honest, that with the new one, in all due respect for the current government, they're not sure what it is yet. Right? I mean, it's still being invented. The other version of looking at this is just saying Islam is Islam. Why does it need all of these qualifiers? Well, it needs these qualifiers for people who want to push it in a certain direction. In my view, anyway, it's people trying to take hold of it, and it is a certain instrumentalizing of Islam.
Miss Faisal Musa. Half of the Muslim population in Malaysia call me Shia, and another half call me liberal. So perhaps I'm a Shia, liberal Shia here. I'm going to respond on your comment to Mr. Miftah's comment on your lecture. Well, I believe that Iran is not the only parameter when we discuss about Shia world. Iran is not the only parameter. Of course, there's Khomainism, but other than Khomainism and Wilayatul Faqih, there's also perhaps a figure like Allama Tabatabai that pretty much suggested on the cultural Islam rather than a political Islam. And of course, we have also Ayatollah Muntaziri, and his student Ayatollah Sistani is still alive. And not to ignore, of course, discourse from Iraq. I've been reading Ayatollah Baharul Ulum and Ayatollah Sistani also. If we're looking at current situation, how he plays with politics, is also an important indicator, I think, to look at. And I believe the thing is very unfortunate that these works and this discourse in this part of the world, the Shia world, they are not available in English, and most of it is in Persian, in Arabic, and sometimes in French or German. But I do believe that one particular figure already been invited by IRF once, Professor Mohsen Kadiva has tried his very best to compile or to collect all these scattered discourses. And in addition to that also, that the Shia will also have this marja'iyah system. And I think that adds to a more complex, because these marja'iyah systems allow the intellectual debate and philosophical debate that enrich the discourse in the Shia world, especially regarding political Islam. Yeah, that's my comment.
Of the kind of richness of the Shi'i world, I think that's really, we need to be reminded of that. And it's true, we don't put that much emphasis on it, but absolutely, the Marja'iyya is an important institution, and the different Marjas and the different sort of exemplary leaders and teachers, etc., have been really important in their ideas. And you mentioned Kadiva, and of course, there are others as well, and who have tried to reframe or recast the way Shiism is presented and understood in the modern period. Kind of reading Shiism or Shi'i sources through a kind of modern sensibility and even a liberal sensibility. So I think it's really important to be reminded of that. And also, one of the interesting things, so I've kind of made the argument that and I think I don't shy away from the argument that the Islamic Republic is essentially a illiberal, authoritarian political order. Simple as that. So whether you're an Ayatollah, you're not an Ayatollah, whether you put Islam in the title or don't put Islam in the title, this is authoritarianism. This is tyranny. So I don't shy away from that, but I do like the idea, your reminder that the authorities in Islam, plural, have created in themselves a kind of pluralism, and therefore a kind of broader check on authoritarianism broadly in history. In other words, the ulama or the ayatollahs disagree among themselves, and they have their own followers, etc. And that's kind of good. That's good, because that kind of undercuts what is now happening, where the dissidents are, of course, excluded in the Islamic Republic. I always get this. I don't know if you've come across him, but I've got this. My famous Ayatollah is a guy named, you probably never heard of, Jawad al-Maghniya, who's a Lebanese. Was a Lebanese Ayatollah, and he bravely wrote a book and said, you know, this Iranian Dawla Islamiyya, it's really a Dawla Khomeiniya. Good point.
Yes, Dr. Sir.
Thank you, Prof, for the very good survey and very broad one. I appreciate that. I'm Azhar Ibrahim. I was just wondering, since you make those survey from the Sunni world, the place of, say, slightly earlier 20th century of Zia Gulkap in Turkey, his position on political Islam, as well as later Muhammad Mahmud Taha in Sudan. If you may comment on that. Yeah. Thank you.
So, in a way, maybe they're different in some, of course, in many ways. But I take your point. And what I would just get out of the Gokap one is just to make the point that, and somebody had alluded to it early, and I just want to emphasize it too, that Islam is also a cultural system, and so the cultural dimensions of Islam are in many ways as important. And I guess in our modern way of looking at this, we might say that the Khaldunian idea of Asabiyya is not just the idea of a kind of a kinship, but that it has cultural forms to it too. And that I think we've seen that in many of the Turkish writers who are reminding us that there is a kind of kinship there, but it's a kinship that might be based on this Islamic worldview. That might be based on this idea of this Weltanschauung, rather than just doctrine itself. So I would take that from some of the Turkish side of it. What I would take from the Mahmud Taha side of it is, I'm sure you know this, that this is I mentioned Abdullahi and Naim, and of course he's a disciple of Taha. And so what do I get? I don't know if you're all familiar with this guy Mahmud Taha. So you're talking about the Sudanese, right? Yeah. So Mahmud Taha was the head of a group called the Republican Brothers in the Sudan, and he was executed by the Numeri regime for ridda, for apostasy. Now, this is strong stuff, execution. And this has made Abdullahi and Naim has pushed his thinking on human rights, etc., and his thinking about the revision of the Sharia far along. Now, what essentially was supposed to be Taha's problem? What was supposed to be his sin? His sin is that he was making a radical, or making, perhaps emphasizing more than others had done, the distinction between the Medinan period of revelation and the Meccan period of revelation. With the argument of Taha and his followers, the Republican Brothers, that we in the modern period should emphasize the Meccan period, because there was more spiritual, more accommodating, more pluralist, etc. The Meccan period, because this is the Medina period, because this is the state, is going to be harsher, penalties, law, harsher. So his argument was you should go with the Meccan surahs. Now, for this he was executed by saying that he had left the faith, etc. So I think what I think he has done is given us a very salutary reminder that there are different injunctions, and that it's, to my mind, nothing wrong with emphasizing that the Meccan surahs perhaps might be given greater weight, etc. Where it becomes difficult is if you start to say the Medinan ones are not valid. That's where it becomes really difficult. And I have to tell you this, Abdullahi Naim has spoken to my students, and Abdullahi Naim, very liberal, very outspokenly liberal, who were shocked at Abdullahi Naim's interpretation of all of this, because he said point blank, the Sharia is wrong, the Quran should be abrogated on certain points. Just do it. Slavery, women, these rulings don't apply in the modern world. Get rid of them. Don't try to reinterpret them. Just say they're invalid. So now, does that go too far? That's interesting. So this is an interesting thing about taking the Taha legacy, and then what do you do with it? So if you stick to the idea that there are distinctions, there are different levels of revelation, okay. But if you then say you're going to get rid of some of the revelatory surahs on the basis they don't fit the modern world, then maybe have you stepped too far?
Well, I have a follow-up questions, I guess, but it's a bit more broad. Because you conclude your lecture on the note on Tajdeed project, or Islah project, basically. And I think you raise a lot of questions about what are the extents of Tajdeed, what are the parameters of Tajdeed, if you like, that we ought to look at. I mean, you are looking at Islamic studies for years now, and I'm sure that you have met all this, a lot of scholars who are working along the Tajdeed project as well. Based on your observation and assessment, what do you think is the main challenges that the current contemporary Tajdeed project is facing? And if there's a problem with it, what are the problems with it? And are they moving the right way? Again, it's a very broad thing, and it's hard to really come up with a broad assessments of it. But again, it's if you can comment on it, maybe it helps us out.
What I was just saying about Taha as an example. I mean, I guess here's the problem, and again, it's that fine line. But then again, when you think about it, you can't be too far ahead of, no ruler can be too far ahead of their people, and no community of the faith can be too far ahead of the believers. So, in a sense, if you're going to start saying you want to abrogate parts of the revelation, you probably have violated an ijma, a kind of social ijma. You probably have. And that might be one of the ways you kind of look at it. So Naim would say, Taha would say, look, what we're doing is we're just reforming it. Call a spade a spade. Just do it. But I mean, seriously, I'm sure that you would agree with me that the vast majority of Muslims would probably be kind of horrified by that idea, or find it uncomfortable that, a direct comment about saying get rid of part of the Quran. Really? I think that must violate a kind of some pretty overwhelming consensus. So I guess that's one way. You can't be too far out there. On the other hand, there are, I suppose there are these, I would think that, I don't know, maybe I don't know, I'd be interested in which other things. Politics is forever, right? Politics is never going to go away. It's just going to take a different form. But don't you think at some point there's going to be a reaction against all these things like ISIS and Al-Qaeda? I mean, I know there is a reaction already. But I mean, there are khutbahs and there are fatwas, I know that. But I mean, where we get a kind of a renewal. who just stands up, kind of like, Sarhindi, who just sort of said, it's what's in your heart. It's not controlling half of Syria and half of Iraq. It's not that. That's not the name of the game. And you would think that at some point, something like that there's going to be a counterbalancing to what's going on. And so it's not just simply the denunciation that these guys have deviated from Islam. It's not just that. It's that, so what is it now? If Islam is not the Islamic State, what is it? And, the clarity by which someone could express that, I think, is probably what is needed. We need it, which I did not.
That I don't know if it's a person, but I do think we're seeing some pushback, I think, in interesting ways against the politicization of religion, of Islam in places like Lebanon and Iraq with the street protests. And I think they're pretty damn brave, because they're going up and they're basically saying enough is enough. What we're looking for are practical solutions to everyday governance, right? And we're not looking for religious answers. We're looking for social justice. We're looking for jobs. We're looking to be able to provide for our families. Very practical issues, which one could define, of course, as Islamic, if one wants to, and people do. But in this case, people are saying enough of almost like religifying everything and just get to it, right? And I think that's an amazing thing to happen in Lebanon when you see so many people across the religious divides coming together and saying and standing up to Hezbollah and just say, and here they're really being caught, I think, out in a very, very positive way, and they're not responding to it very well, but they're basically being told, you're supposed to be governing here in Lebanon, not taking care of business over in Syria. What are you doing there when you're not taking care of the Lebanese, right? And I think that is, on a movement basis, it would be interesting to see if there's people who wind up coming out of that kind of grassroots movement who are willing to speak up in terms of religion based on that.
Yeah, and can I just go back to your first sentence? I think that's a really good point and really good example. But Jeff's first sentence was, I'm not sure about a particular person. This does remind me, whatever you want to call it, civil society organizations, Islamic Renaissance Front. Why aren't these the renewers of our age? In other words, we don't necessarily, we're probably not going to get the person who's going to stand up. The person, in our age, the person is probably going to end up as a demagogue and, be worse. What does this suggest that there aren't renewers? That there aren't people who are trying to think about not only how to renew, but also how to reform? And I think there's a lot of stuff going on, and to embarrass Farouk, his organization, this sort of event, is got to be part of people thinking it out and saying, okay, a simple question I ask you. I know you have an answer, but you should think about it. If it's not the Islamic State, then what is it? And I know you have access to this, but it's the sort of stuff that needs to be sort of articulated more and more. And maybe to pick up a point you had mentioned, by the way, I forgot to discuss, was the point about social media and communications, etc. Maybe this is where that does help, that you're able to get the message across better to a bigger audience.
Yeah, I'm Romadi from Jakarta, National Board of Nahdlatul Ulama. I just want to hear your comment about the one of crucial issue of political Islam is position of non-Muslim. In history, position of non-Muslim in history, or in modern state till now. if we read Fiqh Siyasa or political Islam, there is no concept about non-Muslim like kafir harbi, kafir dhimmi, and musta'man, and so on. What's your comment about this concept in Muslim country? There is continuing or changing to facing this issue.
I'll leave most of the answer for tomorrow because I'm going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow when I talk about the concept of the Ummah. So one of the factors when I'm talking about the concept of the Ummah is how do you deal with the non-Muslim? Are they part of the Ummah? Are they not? You know, that sort of argument. So I'll leave most of it to that. I guess the simple answer at this point is that politicized Islam has not handled it well. So we have, on the one hand, we have this, again, kind of a model, but a fictitious model, that everyone is a citizen of a modern state. And so, therefore, it shouldn't matter what your religious affiliation is. It's got to do with civic duties, not faith. But the reality is, of course, not that. And in cases where there are political Islamic either state or movements, it's tended to treat non-Muslims in an inegalitarian way and a discriminatory way. So Jeff's example of Hezbollah is a good example. So you know, yes, they're an Islamist political movement in Lebanon, a country which is like Indonesia, divided or pluralist, I should say. How do you deal with it? Well, essentially, if you're not a follower, not a believer, then you're not treated equally with their followers. So so I think the answer is that it reproduces, political Islam has reproduced the kind of discriminatory views of maybe of the past, and the presumption that we're beyond all that in a world of equal citizenship just does not ring true. But more.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much for the questions as well. We're supposed to end at 10:30, but again, I'm sure all of you are tired already from your journey to this hotel. Again, I think it's excellent session for our first session. We're going to have another session with Prof tomorrow as well. Thank you very much. And again, just a couple of announcements before you go. You all go. Tomorrow's session is going to start at 9 o'clock. You're going to have your breakfast at 8 downstairs, the same place where you have your dinner today. And if you have any problem with your accommodations as well as your other logistic matters, you can contact Moziru. He's in the WhatsApp group, and I believe all of you are in the WhatsApp group now. With that, I wish you all have a good rest, and thank you very much for coming, and see you again tomorrow. Thank you very much.